So I just want to do a quick run through on the gear train system which is used on the Myford ML7 lathe, and the various ways that, well, first of all how you set it up, and the two sort of different types of gear trains that you can have, like a simple straight through gear train and then onto a compound gear train. Okay, so when we first have a look at the gear train, it all starts off with the first gear, which is actually on the mandrel shaft of the lathe. So I'm just turning the chuck here so you can see that turning. Okay, so the mandrel gear is a 25 tooth gear, and then this gear here, which we call the driver gear, or rather the gear that we will put onto there will become our driver gear. Oops, I'm taking it all off. Let's just pop that back on. So that will become the driver spindle. So it's got, as you can see, in a straight gear train, if you've got two gears which are of the same tooth number, then they will rotate at the same speed. So it doesn't actually matter what size that wheel is in there. Those two will rotate at exactly the same, in the same ratio as each other. Now these two little gears here in the middle are what they call the tumbler reverse gears. So it doesn't matter what comes after that, you know, in the gear train down here. These are solely used so you can actually reverse the direction of the lead screw. So if we look at that, this one's coming clockwise as you're looking at it, yes, and that one's obviously moving clockwise as you're looking at it too. And if you notice, this gear isn't actually doing anything, it's just idling away. Okay, the main drive is running through that gear there, so 1, 2, 3. So obviously if you look now, if you engage the tumbler reverse gears, that now engages onto that the first cog, and that then now drives the second cog, which now drives the other 25 tooth gear, but now it's actually rotating in the opposite direction. So we we're clockwise on this one and counterclockwise on that one. So those two gears are simply used as a reversing system for any other further gear train that you care to add further down below. Okay, so the standard set of gears that comes with the Myford, or you buy extras for the Myford, consists of well, a set of gears. You normally get two 20 tooth gears, and then it basically goes up 25, 30, 35, 40, and it goes up in fives. You also get a 38 tooth gear included, and of course you can buy extra gears. A 21 tooth gear is available primarily for doing metric turning, metric thread cutting, and there's also a 46 available, and there's also a 12 tooth available as well. And there's also obviously bigger gears, such as I've got a 90 there and a 100 tooth pair of gears there. They're mainly used for if you want to really reduce the ratio down so that the lead screw is nice and slow, mostly for you know, if you're doing turning using the lead screw to do the cuttings, you get a really nice slow pass. So if you want to get a really high quality finish, so I don't actually use those for any thread setting up. So the other bits of kit you get, obviously, this here is what's called the banjo. So this has got two slides in there, and you have a stud. Okay, so there's a stud, and it's just got a couple of flats on the side there, so they slip into those flats, lock up at the back with the locking nut there, and then it's just got a simple washer and a screw arrangement. And these are used to position the intermediate gears on that run through the gear train, and they use a little spindle with a keyway which is on it. So those sort of slip on there, and then you can obviously fit, you know, your gear onto there, and that'll now, it's twice as wide as the single gear. It's so that you can then drive a second gear, a second compound gear. so you can drive a second sort of compound gear off that same drive. So I'll explain that in a moment. So what I'm going to set up for here, first of all, if I just take that off a moment, our driver gear. So that's our driver gear, which as you know is turning at the same speed as the lathe. When you look on your chart of what you want to cut, you use a chart such as this and pick the teeth per inch, or threads per inch rather, of which one you want to. You pick the threads per inch. So for our instance, we're going to look at 11 threads per inch, and our driver is a 40. Okay, so I've just written out this so it's a bit easier to follow as I. Can you see that there? Okay, so our driver is a 40. So what I've done with that gear from there, I need to put that driver on there. That's a 40. That's a number 40. Okay, and as you can see, it's got a little keyway, and there's a tiny little keyway which goes in there. I might need to take it off to put it on. Let's take that off, put that in there, and then I can slip on the. A bit fiddly. Okay, so I can fit that on there, and then that can drop into there. So that's our first gear. That's our 40. Okay, let's just put that in there. That's right. Okay. So in the next, I've forgotten what it was. Okay, so the first stud. Now there aren't any drivers or driven wheels in this. They're basically, you know, because it's a straight through. You know, this is the driver, that's the driven, and that's also the driven as well. But that requires us to put on a 60. So there's our 60 tooth. Look, so they're sort of engraved. They are. They're difficult to see on some of them. And so we pop our 60 on there. Okay, and then for our the second stud isn't used in this instance. So there's the stud's been removed, so it doesn't get in the way. And so then we need our mandrel. Our lead screw, which is asking here for a 55. So there's the 55 I've got ready, and that will just yeah. Let me just show you that way. You're not going to. Let me turn this round. You'll see there's a little slot there for this little woodruff key there. So that needs to be dropped in, and then you should be able to slip your 55 gear onto the spindle. Struggling to see. Alright, that's it. Okay, so this is simply the drivetrain that I need to set up to be able to turn the 11 threads per inch thread. And as you can see, that's, you know, this is all still loose, and I also need to be able to stop these gears from working their way off. Okay, so the top one's nice and easy because that only takes a single gear. So you just take your little washer and screw, and you just pinch that up. That's it. That'll stop that. Now this one, of course, is you know, it's twice the thickness. So what you also get in the set is either some spacers like this. This is just a standard spacer, and it's, as you can see, it's got the keyway cut in there. So I could either just pop that spacer on there and then insert the locking screw, or if you don't have enough spacers or anything like that, of course you can use any old gear, because they're all the same. It's not actually, the gear won't be doing any work actually, and I'm just going to use the spacer just so it doesn't confuse us what that extra gear is there for. And then of course just pop the locking screw in on that one too, and again just pinch that up. The lead screw one also requires a spacer in there. So in this case, yeah, I've got a spacer there. I'll use that blank spacer there. Or is that one a bit tight? Okay, that's better. A bit of a struggle. And then if I actually rotate the lead screw, there's also, on the opposite side of that, there's a little flat on there. I don't know whether you can see that. I'll show you that flat. It's a small flat on the top. Okay, so obviously that needs to, on the final locking spacer, there's a locking spacer which has got a small grub screw in there. So you can just line that up over the top of there, and a little pinch up with the screwdriver again. So that locks that one on as well. Okay, so we've selected our gear train, and of course it doesn't actually matter what size this gear is here. I mean, obviously you can't use a little tiny one because there won't be enough room in the slot to be able to pull it up and make that mesh. But you know, I could use a larger wheel here, or a wheel smaller that will still fit, you know, and join the three gears together. But it's basically acting as just an intermediate gear. So the drive of this will still impart the same ratio to this one, and that gear doesn't actually play a part other than being there to make the mechanical motion continuous. Okay, so the final part of setting up our gear train, of course, is that we need to secure this up and make sure that the gears are all nicely meshed. Now, you don't want the gears too tight because they'll start binding against each other and it'll be noisy, and you'll also get wear from your teeth. So all you need to actually do is get a small piece of paper, and I can actually just use that piece there, which I've been demonstrating my thingy on. And if you just push the paper sort of in between the gears like that, and then you can, I need another piece at the top one obviously. Okay, so you can just feed a bit of paper in. You can just roll it in if you want to. Okay, like so, and then that one, you can pull that one up tight and get them to mesh. There we go. And you can just sort of hold that there, and you just want the sort of thickness of the paper to be able to set the space that you've got. And then it's just a case of, it's a bit awkward this, because it's at the back of this, as I said, it was a bit awkward. It's a bit awkward because it's at the back of the banjo, and you can then just nip up the first stud sort of locking bolt at the back, locking nut. Okay, and then you'll be able to wind them out. If I just use that, paper will come out, and then as you can see, it's actually engage the gears. As you can see, they'll rotate nicely round. There's no real noise. In fact, I'll start the lathe up and you'll be able to hear that it's still quite quiet. Okay, and of course, you know, as I talked about earlier, you can engage that reverse there, and that will rotate the lead screw in the opposite direction. Okay, you probably want to, of course, you know, depending on what you're doing, but you might want to reduce the actual mandrel speed by changing the belts, etc. Anyway, so that's sort of set up. As you can see, there's still, you know, you can hear a little bit of backlash in there, but obviously remember, when it's driving, it's only driving in one direction, so that backlash is automatically taken up, you know, by the rotation of the gears and the meshing of the gears. So that's a simple gear train. So all the gears are actually in the same straight line. So there's nothing actually, there's no compound gears or anything. Everything's in just a dead straight line. So this one's basically driving this one, which is driving that one, but the ratio remains the same between these two. So if that was, say, a 60 tooth and that was a 60 tooth, you're going to get a 1-to-1 ratio. If this gear here was 60, or say it's a 30 tooth and that was a 60 tooth, obviously you're now getting a step down ratio, and if it was the other way around, it'd be a step up ratio of 2-to-1 basically. Okay, so I'm just going to strip this back down now, so I can now show you a compound gear train. Just another little thing I'd like to show you. Sometimes these get a little bit stuck, these little internal bushings, I guess you could call them. And what I've made myself is a little brass, well it's just a piece of 3/4 inch brass that's been turned down. Firstly, that part there has been turned down so it fits into there, and then that outside diameter is just about 4th thou undersize there, so that'll fit then through there. As you can see, just a couple of thou down, and you can simply use it. You can pop it in there, so if one gets stuck, you can just use a hammer and you can gently tap that through. And as you can see, those flats that I was talking about earlier, so that's you've got a nut and washer that go on the end there, and that just fits in there, and the flats just stop, prevent that from rotating. Now they're really difficult to get the nuts on the back. With my position, the way the lathe is, I can't sort of access this side of the gear train easily, so I have to kind of work from the back. Well, I suppose one thing you can do as well, these two nuts here, you can loosen those off like that, and this of course allows the banjo to move within those slots there. So depending on how your gears fit, you'll need to adjust that in there as well. You can also take this off completely. If you're finding difficulty, if you're like me, you haven't got the access, you can take this off and actually build the gears up sort of on the bench, etc. But I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to struggle to get this on. Okay, so now I've got the second stud attached, as you can see. So the first stud and the second stud, they both move freely on the banjo, and the banjo itself you can move up and down. So everything's nice and loose and ready to start assembling a compound gear. Now naturally, it's always a good idea, you want to make sure your gears are nice and clean as well before assembly. You don't want little bits of swarf in there or anything that are going to cause any problems. Okay, so this time I'm going to be looking at how to set up a compound gear train, and I've chosen from my chart, I've chosen 64 64 threads per inch, and that gives us a 0.0167 feed rate, so feeds per revolution, so that's thousandths of an inch. And we look down our chart to 64. I'm struggling to see this, and I'm sure you probably are as well. So I've just drawn up, like I did before, another little chart. I'll probably put that there. Get that over there, you can see it better. I still can't see it very well, but anyway, so, and I've chosen obviously the gears which are required. So we start off with 64 threads per inch is what we're looking at. So our first one off is the driver at 35, and then on our first stud here we've got a driver of 40 and a driven at 20. So coming back to our driver, look, there's our 35 driver, so we can I'll just pop that on now. So just need to put that little tiny keyway in there, and then I should be able to pop that on. Put my glasses on, I might be able to see what I'm doing. Okay, so that's the driver on there. So our first stud now requires a driver of 40 and a driven of 20. Okay, so obviously I've just assembled those, with one of these collars with the keyway in there. So I've built that up as a cluster. And then as for our second stud, which requires a driver of 60 and then a driven of 30. Okay, and of course our final lead gear, which drives the lead screw, is a 70 gear, 70 tooth there. Okay, and we'll start with our first stud. So the driven one is obviously the 40, so that's the larger one, so that wants to come into mesh with the main driver gear there. So we'll just pop that on there, okay, like that. When you consider it, this is the driver and that is a driven gear, okay, but then when you sort of consider it on its own as a cluster gear, as the cluster of two gears, that is now the driver gear because it's driving the smaller one, so the smaller one becomes the driven gear. Okay, so driver and driven. So the first one, the driver, is the 40 and the driven gear is the 20. Okay, so in our next cluster we've now got a driven gear, sorry, the driver gear is the 60 and the driven is the 30. So we know that actually we need to flip that around so that this becomes the driver gear, and the one at the back, the smaller one at the back, if you can see, when it's pushed up it won't actually make contact with the first gear. I'll bring that one down. So that gear there is meshing with this gear, and obviously that gear, you know, it's not touching the gear at the back. So that is the driver, that's the driven, that's the driver, that's the driven. Okay, can you see that? Okay, so let me just put the camera back. So obviously then the lead, which is the 70, needs to be driven not from obviously that cog but from the one at the back there, so it needs to mesh sort of into the back there and then go onto the lead screw like that. So if we just pop, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll just pop the lead screw on, if I can find the little woodruff key, turn that around a bit, pop the woodruff key in, pop on the 70, turn that around so you can see the numbers. So let's get that lined up. Okay, and then that gear cluster will drop onto there. Okay, and that will mesh, the back gear there will mesh with the lead screw gear, and that gear will mesh with that one. And so all the other gears miss each other, like this gear at the back misses that one down there, etc, etc. So as you can see now, so it's driver driven, driver driven, and the driven is then onto the lead screw. Okay, and that's basically our how you assemble it. So what I'll do now is I'll finish this off. I'll put the locking screws in here, and then I'll come around to tightening it all up and showing you the best way to do that. So we'll just fast forward a bit here. And then of course you need to now pinch up the two nuts at the back of stud 1 and stud 2, so it locks that all together. This is the awkward bit for me. So now that's all meshed together, you then get yourself another little bit of paper, and then you can lift up the banjo to come in contact now with the main drive there. So again, we just use our bit of paper, get it to mesh in. That's it, like so. And then of course, whilst holding the banjo up, you can now just lock up those two screws there which hold it onto the lead screw. Hold the banjo onto the lead screw. Okay, and now we're all meshed. Okay, so to just get that out, we can just engage the gear like that and wind that back out there. So now, as you can see, all the gears are meshed together, and because this is a compound gear train, you can see that it rather than following, you know, just a single straight route through as was previous, it now follows through. So you've got your driver onto your, that's your main driver, onto the first stud, the driver, and then the driven, and the driven is now driving the second stud gear. So that becomes the driver, and this little stud at the back, sorry, the little gear at the back is now the driven, and then that is obviously driving onto the lead screw gear. So that now sets us up. That's called a compound gear train. Okay, so a bit of spray grease. So there it is. It's all set up now for 64 threads per inch. So now, if you see, if I engage the lead screw, and I'll just check everything's okay. Yeah, I'll just start the lathe up. Now, as you can see, that's moving in reverse. I didn't want to do that, so all I use is the this lever here to change the tumbler reverse, and now that will actually be running in, running towards. As you can see there, it's rotating. The handle is rotating. And now that's moving in at 64 threads per inch. So thanks to the gear train. So I do hope that was useful to you, and see you again soon.